Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I was 16, a sophomore at Lincoln High back in 2012, and absolutely nothing about me screamed, "Cool kid." Neither did my best friend Danny. We'd been inseparable since kindergarten, two socially awkward kids who found refuge in anime, video games, and our shared inability to talk to girls without our voices cracking. Danny came over every weekend without fail, and we'd lose ourselves in whatever new series we'd discovered or spend hours grinding levels in whatever RPG had caught our attention. That particular Friday in October, we were huddled around my laptop in the computer lab during lunch period. Danny had been bragging all week about some premium content he'd gotten from a Discord server, rare anime episodes, exclusive manga chapters, the kind of stuff that made us feel like we were part of some secret club. I watched him navigate through folders with names like Ultra Rare and Limited Edition, my curiosity growing with each click. "Dude, check this out," Danny whispered, his fingers hovering over a folder labeled Premium Content. His eyes had that mischievous glint that usually meant trouble, but I leaned in anyway. The folder opened to reveal dozens of files with suggestive thumbnails and titles that made my face burn red. It wasn't anything too extreme by internet standards, but for two sheltered 16-year-olds, it might as well have been contraband. We were so absorbed in our discovery that we didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching behind us. Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through our whispered excitement like a blade. "What exactly are you two looking at?" The entire computer lab fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward us as Danny frantically tried to close the browser windows, his mouse clicking wildly as more inappropriate images flashed across the screen. Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted from curiosity to disgust to stern disapproval in the span of 3 seconds. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might actually throw up right there on the keyboard. "Principal's office. Now," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. The walk to the principal's office felt like a death march, with students in the hallway staring and whispering as we passed. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, and Danny looked like he was about to cry. Principal Rodriguez didn't waste time with pleasantries. Within an hour, both sets of parents had been called. The conversation was brief, clinical, and mortifying. Words like inappropriate material and serious violation of school policy echoed in my ears as I sat there wanting to disappear into the floor. Dad picked me up in his old pickup truck, and the silence during the drive home was suffocating. I could feel his disappointment radiating from the driver's seat like heat from a furnace. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he sat there for a long moment with the engine running, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. "I talked to Mr. Stevens," he finally said, referring to Danny's father. "You boys have two options. You can be grounded for a month, no internet, no games, no leaving the house except for school. Or you can come hunting with me this weekend." He turned to look at me, his gray eyes serious. "Your choice. But you're both getting the same punishment." That night, Danny and I texted back and forth for hours, weighing our options. A month without internet felt like a death sentence, but hunting wasn't exactly appealing either. Neither of us had ever been hunting before, and the idea of killing animals made us both uncomfortable. But Dad had been trying to get me to go hunting with him for years, always saying it would make a man out of me or teach me about the real world. I'd always found excuses to avoid it. "At least we'd be outside doing something," Danny texted. "Better than being locked up like prisoners." "Yeah, and it's only one weekend," I replied. "How bad could it be?" Looking back now, I realized that was probably the last normal conversation Danny and I would ever have. Friday after school, Dad picked both of us up in his truck, the back loaded with hunting gear and supplies. The drive to his cabin in northern Michigan took nearly 4 hours, winding through increasingly remote roads until we were surrounded by nothing but dense forest and the occasional rundown gas station. The further we drove, the more excited Dad became, humming along to classic rock on the radio and pointing out landmarks from his own childhood hunting trips. "You boys are going to love this," he said for the 10th time, glancing at us in the rearview mirror. "Nothing like being out in nature, away from all those computers and video games. This'll put some hair on your chest." Danny and I exchanged a look that said everything. This was going to be a long weekend. The cabin sat in a small clearing about a mile off the main road, accessible only by a rutted dirt path that made the truck bounce and groan with every pothole. It was smaller than I'd expected, just 2 rooms and a loft, built from logs that had darkened with age and weather. The interior smelled like pine needles, old coffee, and something else. Something earthy and organic that I couldn't quite identify. Dad spent the first hour giving us a comprehensive tour of his hunting equipment, laying everything out on the small kitchen table like a military inspection. Rifles, ammunition, hunting knives with worn leather handles, camouflage clothing that smelled like mothballs, bright orange safety vests, compasses, and first aid supplies. Each item came with a detailed explanation of its purpose and a stern lecture about safety. "Rule number 1, Dad said, holding up his index finger. "Never point a gun at anything unless you intend to shoot it. Rule number 2, always identify your target before you shoot. Rule number 3, stay within sight of each other at all times. These woods can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." The way he said dangerous made something cold settle in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. Dad had been hunting these woods for 20 years. If anyone knew how to stay safe out here, it was him. We heated up canned beef stew for dinner, eating by lamplight since the cabin had no electricity. The silence outside was absolute. No traffic, no neighbors, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the occasional crack of settling wood and the distant hoot of an owl. Dad regaled us with hunting stories from his youth, his eyes bright with enthusiasm in the flickering lamplight. "We'll be up at 4, he announced as we prepared for bed. "Deer are most active at dawn and dusk. You'll see. There's nothing like watching the forest wake up." Danny climbed into the top bunk while I took the bottom, but neither of us could fall asleep. Every sound outside seemed amplified in the darkness. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the scratch of something small scurrying across the roof. The woods were alive with sounds I couldn't identify, and my imagination began filling in the blanks with creatures and scenarios that made my heart race. "You awake?" Danny whispered from above. "Yeah, this place is creepy as hell." "Tell me about it. What do you think is making all that noise?" "Probably just animals, raccoons or whatever." But even as I said it, I wasn't convinced. There was something about the sounds that seemed wrong somehow. Too deliberate, too organized. Like something was moving through the forest with purpose. I must have finally drifted off around midnight, because the next thing I knew, Dad was shaking me awake in what felt like the middle of the night. 4 in the morning came like a slap to the face. Dad was already dressed and making coffee and oatmeal by the light of his camping lantern, moving around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency. Outside, the world was still black as pitch, with only the faintest hint of gray on the eastern horizon. "Rise and shine, boys," Dad said cheerfully, as if getting up before dawn was the most natural thing in the world. "Early bird gets the worm, and the early hunter gets the deer." Danny and I stumbled around in the darkness, struggling into our borrowed camouflage clothing and trying to wake up enough to function. The hunting gear felt foreign and uncomfortable. The jacket was too big, the boots too heavy, and the orange safety vest made me feel like a construction worker. Dad checked our rifles one more time, walking us through the loading and safety procedures with military precision. "Remember," he said, his voice serious in the pre-dawn darkness, "we're hunting deer. Nothing else. If you see anything that isn't a deer, you don't shoot. Understood?" We nodded, though I wondered what else we might encounter out here that would require such a specific warning. The hike into the woods was surreal, our flashlight beams creating small pools of light in an ocean of darkness. The air was crisp and cold, our breath visible in small puffs of vapor. Dew soaked through my boots within minutes, and I could feel the moisture seeping into my socks. Every step seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, the crunch of leaves and snap of twigs echoing through the trees. We walked for nearly an hour, following what Dad called game trails, paths through the forest that were invisible to my untrained eyes but apparently obvious to him. The trees grew denser as we moved deeper into the woods, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out even the faint starlight. Finally, Dad stopped in a small clearing and began setting up what he called a blind, a camouflaged shelter where we could wait for deer to appear. The structure was simple but effective, providing concealment while giving us a clear view of the surrounding area. "This is where patience comes in," Dad whispered as we settled in to wait. "Hunting is 90% waiting and 10% action. The key is to stay quiet and alert." As the sun began to rise, the forest gradually came alive around us. The darkness retreated slowly, revealing details that had been hidden in the night. Trees took shape, their bark textured and varied. Undergrowth became visible, thick with ferns and fallen logs. Birds began to sing, their voices creating a natural symphony that was both beautiful and slightly unsettling. But as the morning progressed, I began to notice something odd. The birds that had been singing so enthusiastically at dawn gradually fell silent. At first, I thought it was just the natural progression of morning activities, but the silence seemed to spread through the forest like a wave, starting from somewhere deeper in the woods and moving toward us. Danny noticed it too. He kept shifting in his position, looking around nervously and opening his mouth as if to say something before Dad's stern looks reminded him to stay quiet. But even Dad seemed to sense that something had changed. His relaxed posture became more alert, and his eyes scanned the tree line with increased intensity. By 8 o'clock, we still hadn't seen any deer, and the forest had become unnaturally quiet. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like the entire woods were holding their breath. "Let's move to another spot," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sometimes the deer change their patterns." We packed up our minimal gear and began moving deeper into the forest, following another of Dad's invisible trails. The trees grew even denser here, their branches interlocking overhead to create a natural tunnel. Less light filtered through the canopy, and the air felt cooler, almost damp. That's when Dad suddenly stopped, his entire body going rigid. He held up his hand for silence and pointed ahead through the trees. At first I couldn't see anything unusual, just more forest, more shadows, more undergrowth. But then I noticed movement about 50 yards ahead, small shapes moving between the trees with an odd, jerky motion. Dad motioned for us to get down, and we crouched behind a fallen log. He pulled out his binoculars and studied the area for what felt like an eternity, his face growing increasingly tense. When he finally lowered the binoculars, his expression was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. A mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. "Tell me what you see," he whispered, handing me the binoculars. Through the binoculars, the distant figures came into sharp focus, and my blood seemed to freeze in my veins. 3 small shapes moved between the trees, no more than 3 feet tall, but they definitely weren't children. Their movements were all wrong, too stiff, too angular, like marionettes being operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with a sickly gray undertone that made them look diseased. They appeared to be naked, but their bodies were somehow wrong, proportioned in a way that hurt to look at. Their limbs were too long for their torsos, their heads too large for their necks. They moved in perfect synchronization, bending down to collect something from the forest floor before straightening up and moving to the next location. Whatever they were gathering, They placed it in small sacks or pouches that seemed to be made from some kind of organic material. The most disturbing thing was their faces. Even through the binoculars, I couldn't make out distinct features, just dark hollows where eyes should be and holes that might have been mouths. When they turned their heads, which they did frequently, the motion was too fast, too sharp, like birds of prey scanning for threats. I felt Danny nudging me urgently, and I reluctantly handed him the binoculars. His sharp intake of breath told me he was seeing the same impossible things I had witnessed. When he tried to whisper, "What the hell?" Dad immediately motioned for complete silence, his face grave with concern. I looked at my father, this man who had always been my anchor of normalcy and strength, and saw genuine fear in his eyes for the first time in my life. He'd been hunting these woods for 20 years, knew every trail and landmark, every type of wildlife that called this forest home. Whatever those things were, they weren't part of his familiar world. "What are they?" I mouthed silently. Dad shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the distant figures. He took the binoculars back and studied them for another long moment before whispering so quietly I could barely hear him. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like this." The three creatures continued their methodical collection, moving through the underbrush with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this many times before. They communicated with each other, but not with sounds. Instead, they used quick, jerky gestures that looked almost like sign language. Occasionally, one would pause and tilt its oversized head, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Danny was breathing heavily beside me, and I could see him struggling not to panic. His face had gone completely white, and his hands were shaking as he gripped his rifle. I reached over and touched his arm, trying to provide some comfort, but I was just as terrified as he was. That's when Danny made the mistake that changed everything. In his nervousness, he shifted his weight too quickly and lost his balance. His elbow caught on a protruding root, sending him tumbling backward with a crash that echoed through the silent forest like a gunshot. His rifle hit the ground with a metallic clang that seemed to reverberate forever. The effect on the three creatures was immediate and terrifying. They stopped moving instantly, their heads snapping toward our location with that same unnaturally fast motion. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel them focusing their attention on us, like the weight of their gaze was a physical force pressing against my chest. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other across the forest floor. The creatures remained perfectly still, their dark eye hollows fixed on our hiding spot. Dad's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I could see his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, all three creatures began moving toward us. Not running, not rushing, but walking with that same jerky, unnatural gait. Their movements were purposeful and coordinated, like hunters who had just spotted their prey. "Run!" Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run now!" We exploded from our hiding spot like startled deer, crashing through the underbrush without any regard for stealth or safety. Branches tore at our clothes and scratched our faces as we fled deeper into the forest. Behind us, I could hear Dad shouting instructions, but his words were lost in the thunder of our panic and the sound of breaking branches. Danny stumbled again, going down hard and crying out as he hit the ground. Dad stopped to help him while I kept running, my mind blank with terror. Every shadow looked like a pursuing figure. Every movement in my peripheral vision made my heart race faster. "Keep going!" Dad's voice echoed behind me. "Get back to the cabin. We'll catch up." I hesitated for just a moment, torn between loyalty to my friend and the overwhelming need to escape. But Dad's voice carried an authority I'd never heard before, a command that brooked no argument. "Go." So I ran. The forest became a blur of green and brown as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping across my face and thorns tearing at my clothes. My lungs burned with the effort of running, and my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. Every sound behind me, every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, convinced me that those things were gaining ground. I had no idea if I was going in the right direction. The trails that Dad had followed so confidently were invisible to me, and every tree looked the same. Panic made it impossible to think clearly, to remember the landmarks we'd passed on the way in. All I could do was run and hope that instinct would guide me back to safety. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, I burst through the tree line into the familiar clearing where the cabin sat. I'd never been so relieved to see that small, weathered building. My legs gave out as I reached the front door and I collapsed against it, gasping for air and shaking uncontrollably. It took several minutes before I could steady my hands enough to work the door handle. Once inside, I immediately locked the door behind me and grabbed Dad's shotgun from the rack above the fireplace. My fingers fumbled with the shells as I tried to load it, dropping several on the floor in my haste. The simple mechanical action of loading the weapon helped calm my nerves slightly, giving my hands something to do while my mind raced. I positioned myself facing the door and window, the shotgun across my knees, and waited. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every sound outside, the whisper of wind through the trees, the creak of settling wood, the distant call of a bird, made me jump and tighten my grip on the weapon. 1 hour passed, then another. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. Where were Dad and Danny? What had happened after I ran? The possibilities that ran through my mind were too terrible to contemplate, but I couldn't stop imagining the worst. As afternoon faded into evening, I heard footsteps approaching the cabin. Heavy, deliberate steps that sounded human, but somehow wrong. I raised the shotgun, my finger hovering over the trigger, and held my breath. 3 knocks echoed through the small cabin. "Son, it's us," came Dad's voice through the door. "Open up." Relief flooded through me so intensely that I almost cried. But something made me hesitate. There was something about Dad's voice that didn't sound quite right. It was flatter than usual, lacking the warmth and inflection I was used to. It sounded like someone doing an impression of my father. "Dad?" I called back, not moving from my position. "Yes," came the reply. "Open the door. Danny's hurt." I moved to the window and peered out carefully. There they were, Dad and Danny standing on the small porch, looking perfectly normal. Dad was wearing the same hunting clothes he'd put on that morning, and Danny was standing upright, apparently uninjured despite the claim that he was hurt. But something was wrong with the way they stood. Too straight, too still, like soldiers at attention. And Danny wasn't looking at the cabin. His gaze was fixed on some point in the distance, his expression blank and vacant. "What happened out there?" I called through the door, still not moving to unlock it. "We'll explain inside," Dad replied in that same flat tone. "Open the door." "Danny, are you okay?" I asked directly. Danny's head turned toward the sound of my voice, but his movement was too sharp, too quick. Exactly like the motions of those creatures in the forest. When our eyes met through the window, there was no recognition in his gaze, no spark of the friendship we'd shared for 11 years. His eyes were empty, like looking into the windows of an abandoned house. But they were my father and my best friend. Whatever had happened in the woods, whatever had frightened us so badly, they were here now and they were alive. That had to count for something. Slowly, reluctantly, I unlocked the door. Dad and Danny entered the cabin with movements that were subtly wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Dad walked too stiffly, his usual casual stride replaced by something mechanical and precise. Danny moved like he was concentrating on each step, as if walking had become something that required conscious thought rather than instinct. The first thing Dad did was take the shotgun from my hands. "Don't need this now," he said. his voice carrying that same flat quality I'd noticed through the door. There was no warmth in it, no relief at our reunion, no acknowledgement of the terror we'd all experienced in the woods. Danny sat heavily on the small couch, his gaze fixed on the floor. His clothes were dirty and torn, consistent with our panicked flight through the forest, but there were no visible injuries. No cuts, no bruises, nothing to explain why Dad had claimed he was hurt. "What happened after I left?" I asked, settling into the chair across from them. "Those things in the woods, what were they?" Dad began packing our gear with methodical efficiency, folding clothes and organizing equipment as if we were checking out of a hotel. "What things?" he asked without looking up. The question hit me like a physical blow. The creatures we saw, the small ones collecting stuff from the forest floor, we all saw them through the binoculars. "We didn't see anything," Dad replied, his voice emotionless. "There was a bear. We ran. That's all." I stared at him in disbelief. A bear? That was his explanation for what we'd witnessed. "Dad, that's not what happened. Those things weren't bears. They were... We're leaving now," Dad interrupted, cutting off my protests. He continued packing with the same mechanical precision, never pausing to look at me or acknowledge what I was saying. I turned to Danny, desperate for support, for someone to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. "Danny, tell him. You saw them too. You looked through the binoculars." Danny finally raised his head to meet my gaze, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach lurch. There was no recognition there, no memory of our shared experience, no acknowledgement of our lifelong friendship. When he spoke, his voice had the same flat quality as Dad's. "Your father's right," he said slowly, as if each word required effort. "It was just a bear." But even as he said it, I could see his hands trembling slightly, and there was something in his expression. Fear, maybe. Or a desperate plea for me to stop asking questions. His eyes seemed to be trying to communicate something his words couldn't say. The drive home was a nightmare of silence and tension. Dad drove with the same mechanical precision he'd shown while packing, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Danny sat beside me in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Every attempt I made at conversation was met with monosyllabic responses or complete silence. When we dropped Danny off at his house, I expected some acknowledgement of our friendship, some promise to talk later about what had really happened. Instead, he got out of the truck without a word, walking toward his front door with that same stiff, unnatural gait. "Danny!" I called after him through the window. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" He paused at his front door and turned back toward me. For just a moment, his expression seemed to flicker, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been the real Danny trying to communicate. But then his face went blank again, and he nodded once before disappearing into his house. At home, Mom was waiting in the kitchen with dinner prepared and questions about our hunting trip. Dad's response was brief and emotionless. "Fine." He headed straight for the basement, and I could hear him moving around down there for hours, doing something that involved a lot of heavy lifting and what sounded like construction. That night, lying in my bed and staring at the ceiling, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of my mind wanted to accept Dad's explanation. Maybe the stress and fear had made us see things that weren't there. Maybe it really had been just a bear, and our imaginations had filled in the terrifying details. But I couldn't shake the memory of those pale, wrong-shaped figures moving through the forest with such purpose. I couldn't forget the way they'd all turned toward us when Danny made noise, or the way they'd begun approaching us with that coordinated predatory movement. And I couldn't ignore the fact that both Dad and Danny had returned fundamentally changed, as if something essential had been removed from them and replaced with a hollow imitation. Danny didn't call the next day, or the day after that. When I finally worked up the courage to call him, his mother answered and said he was sleeping, that he'd been very tired since the hunting trip. The third time I called, she said he wasn't feeling well and couldn't come to the phone. When I saw him at school the following Monday, it was like looking at a stranger wearing Danny's face. Danny's transformation became more apparent with each passing day at school. He moved through the hallways like he was navigating an unfamiliar maze, pausing at intersections and staring at familiar faces as if he couldn't quite remember who they were. Our shared interests, anime, video games, the inside jokes that had sustained our friendship for years, seemed to have been wiped from his memory completely. During lunch, I cornered him at his usual table in the cafeteria. "Dude, we need to talk about what happened in the woods," I said, keeping my voice low. "Something's wrong with you, and something's wrong with my dad." Danny looked at me with those empty eyes, chewing his sandwich with mechanical precision. "Nothing happened in the woods," he said in that same flat tone that had become his default mode of communication. "We saw a bear. We ran. End of story." "Stop lying," I hissed, frustration boiling over. "We've been best friends since we were 5 years old. You can't just pretend that those things we saw weren't real." For just a moment, something flickered across Danny's face, a brief crack in the facade that revealed the terror lurking beneath. His hand started to shake, and he dropped his sandwich onto the table. When he looked at me, I could see the real Danny trapped behind those vacant eyes, struggling to communicate something his mouth couldn't say. "Drop it," he whispered, glancing around the cafeteria as if he expected to see something watching us. "For your own good, just drop it." That was the last real conversation we had. Danny started avoiding me after that, taking different routes through the hallways and sitting with different people at lunch. When I tried to approach him, he would walk away without a word. It was like watching my best friend die and be replaced by a hollow shell. A month later, Danny's parents transferred him to a private school across town. They said he needed a fresh start and that the public school environment wasn't right for him anymore. I never saw him again. Things at home deteriorated just as rapidly. Dad spent increasingly long periods in the basement, sometimes disappearing down there for entire days. He installed a heavy padlock on the basement door, and when I asked him about it, he just stared at me with those wrong eyes until I looked away. The sounds from the basement became a constant source of anxiety. I could hear him talking down there, but it sounded like he was having conversations with multiple people. The voices that responded didn't sound quite human. They were too high-pitched, too sharp, like the chirping of birds, but with an underlying intelligence that made my skin crawl. Mom noticed the changes too, though she tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. "Your father's just going through something," she told me one evening as we sat at the dinner table without him. Men his age sometimes have difficulties adjusting to changes in their lives. But I could see the worry in her eyes, the way she glanced nervously toward the basement door whenever those strange sounds drifted upstairs. She'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. Dad's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped going to work, claiming he was taking a leave of absence to focus on important research. When his boss called the house looking for him, Dad would disappear into the basement and refuse to come out until the phone stopped ringing. He began taking long walks at night, leaving the house after we'd gone to bed and returning before dawn. I started staying awake to listen for his return, and the sounds he made coming back were wrong. His footsteps were too light, too quick, and sometimes I could swear I heard other footsteps accompanying his. Smaller, quicker steps that didn't sound like they belonged to human feet. In the mornings, I would find evidence of his nocturnal activities. Mud tracked through the kitchen that had an odd, organic smell unlike regular dirt, and small scratches on his arms and face that he couldn't or wouldn't explain. His clothes would be filthy and sometimes torn, as if he'd been crawling through underbrush or digging in the earth. The final straw came on a cold morning in December, 3 months after our hunting trip. I woke to the sound of screaming. I found Mom on the bathroom floor, her body convulsing as some invisible force seemed to be tearing through her nervous system. Dad stood in the doorway watching, his expression utterly blank, as if he were observing a mildly interesting television program, rather than his wife's medical emergency. "Call 911!" I screamed at him as I knelt beside Mom, trying to remember what I'd learned about seizures in health class. But Dad just stood there, motionless, those wrong eyes fixed on Mom's writhing form with what might have been clinical curiosity. I called 911 myself, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to Dad's eerie passivity. They worked on Mom with practiced skill, checking her vital signs and asking questions that Dad answered in monosyllables. "Stroke," one of the paramedics told me as they loaded Mom onto a stretcher. "Severe one. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." I expected Dad to ride in the ambulance or at least follow us to the hospital, but he simply stood in the driveway and watched as we drove away. When I looked back through the rear window, he was still standing there, perfectly still, like a statue of a man rather than a living human being. Mom spent 2 weeks in the ICU, her brain activity monitored by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence. The doctors said there had been massive damage, that even if she survived, she would likely never be the same. Dad visited exactly once, standing beside her bed for 5 minutes before leaving without a word. She died on a Tuesday morning while I was at school. Dad picked me up from the principal's office, delivered the news in that same flat tone he'd used for everything else, and drove us home in silence. At the funeral, he stood apart from everyone else, showing no emotion as they lowered Mom's casket into the ground. When people tried to offer their condolences, Dad would stare at them with those empty eyes until they became uncomfortable and walked away. Several family friends commented on how different he seemed, how the loss had changed him. If they only knew how right they were. The year and a half that followed were the worst of my life. Living alone with the thing that had replaced my father was like being trapped in a house with a barely functional robot that occasionally remembered it was supposed to pretend to be human. He rarely spoke, rarely ate, and spent almost all his time in that locked basement. Strange packages began arriving at irregular intervals, small boxes wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Dad would take them directly to the basement, and I would hear sounds down there that suggested he was opening them and distributing their contents to something. The organic smell that had always emanated from the basement grew stronger, accompanied by new odors that made me gag when they drifted upstairs. Sometimes I would find tiny footprints in the mud by the back door. Footprints that were roughly human-shaped but wrong in ways that made my brain refuse to process them completely. They were too small to belong to an adult, but they had too many toes, and the proportions were all wrong. Dad's physical transformation accelerated during this period. He lost weight rapidly, his skin taking on that same grayish, translucent quality I'd seen in the creatures in the forest. His movements became even more mechanical and precise, and sometimes I would catch him moving his head with that same sharp, bird-like motion that had terrified me in the woods. I counted down the days until my 18th birthday with the desperate intensity of a prisoner awaiting parole. I applied to colleges as far from home as possible, eventually choosing a school in California that offered me a partial scholarship. Dad showed no interest in my plans, no emotion when I told him I was leaving. He simply nodded once and returned to whatever he was doing in the basement. On graduation day, Dad didn't attend the ceremony. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma with an empty chair where my father should have been sitting. That night, as I packed my belongings for the move to California, I could hear him in the basement having one of his conversations with those other voices. I left the next morning while he was on one of his nocturnal walks, unable to face another emotionless goodbye. I left a note on the kitchen table explaining that I was starting my new life and didn't know when I'd be back. Looking back at the house as I drove away, I realized I was probably seeing it for the last time. College was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life among people who didn't know about my strange family history. I made friends, joined clubs, and slowly began to feel human again. The nightmares came less frequently, and I started to believe that maybe I could leave the past behind. But I couldn't shake the need to know what had happened to Dad, what those things in the forest had been, and why Danny and I had been the only ones to see them. During winter break of my freshman year, I drove back to Michigan to collect the rest of my belongings and hopefully get some answers. The house looked abandoned when I pulled into the driveway. The grass was overgrown, newspapers and mail had piled up on the front porch, and several windows had been broken by storm damage that no one had bothered to repair. The neighbors said they hadn't seen Dad in months. Using my old key, I entered the house that no longer felt like home. The smell hit me immediately. That organic, earthy odor I remembered from the basement, but now it permeated the entire house. The furniture was covered in dust, and there were more of those strange footprints tracked across the floors. Dad's bedroom was completely empty. His clothes, his personal belongings, even his furniture. Everything was gone, as if he had simply evaporated. The only sign that he'd ever lived there was a thin layer of dust in the shape of a bed frame on the hardwood floor. Steeling myself for what I might find, I used the key hanging beside the basement door to unlock it for the first time. The basement was empty too. Completely empty except for a single piece of paper lying in the center of the concrete floor. I picked up the paper with trembling hands. Written in Dad's familiar handwriting were 3 words. They are home. Below that, in a different handwriting, smaller, more angular, like the scratching of claws on paper, was a single line. The cycle continues. That night, staying in a motel near the highway, I called the police to report Dad missing. They filed a report, but as the detective explained, adults have the right to disappear if they want to. They'd investigate if evidence of foul play emerged, but for now, it was just another missing person case in a world full of people who walked away from their lives. I sold the house through a real estate attorney, never setting foot in it again. The buyers were a young couple with 2 small children who were excited about the rustic charm of the property. I wondered if they would notice the strange smells, the odd sounds that came from the basement, the footprints that appeared in the mud after certain kinds of rain. I never returned to my hometown after that. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself searching online for missing person reports from that area of Michigan. There have been several over the years. People who went into those woods and never came out, or who came out changed in ways their families couldn't explain. And sometimes, when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment in California, I can swear I hear the sound of small, quick footsteps moving through the darkness, accompanied by voices that are too high-pitched to be human, but too intelligent to be animal. The hunting trip was supposed to make men out of Danny and me. Instead, it showed us that there are things in this world that are better left undiscovered, creatures that exist in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're capable of understanding. I'm 26 now, graduated from college, working a normal job, living a normal life. But every hunting season, when the leaves begin to turn and the air grows cold, I remember those pale figures moving through the forest with their jerky, purposeful gait. I remember Dad's empty eyes and Danny's terrified silence. And I wonder if somewhere in those Michigan woods, they're still out there, still collecting whatever it was they gathered from the forest floor, still waiting for the next group of hunters to stumble into their territory. The cycle continues, just like the note said. Some nights, when the dreams are particularly vivid, I wake up with the taste of pine needles in my mouth and the smell of that organic, earthy odor filling my nostrils. On those nights, I check all the locks on my doors and windows, and I remind myself that I'm hundreds of miles away from those woods. But I know, deep in my bones, that distance doesn't matter to creatures like that. They're patient, they're organized, and they remember everyone who has seen them. The hunting trip taught me that there are predators in this world far more dangerous than bears or wolves. The real predators walk upright, speak in whispers, and know how to wear the faces of the people we love. And once they've noticed you, once you've stumbled into their territory and witnessed their work, you become part of their collection. Maybe not right away, maybe not for years, but eventually. Eventually, everyone comes home. I was 19 that summer of 2019, staying at my grandparents' old farmhouse outside Azal, Texas, trying to get my head straight after dropping out of college. The weight of disappointing my family pressed down on me like the oppressive August heat, and I needed space to think. That particular afternoon, with the sun hanging low and casting everything in amber light, I decided to take a walk through the woods behind the property. These weren't just any woods to me. I'd been exploring them since I was 7 years old, when my parents first started leaving me here for extended summer visits. Every trail, every fallen log, every clearing was mapped in my memory like the layout of my childhood bedroom. The rusted barbed wire fence that marked the property line, the deer path that meandered toward the creek, the ancient oak with the lightning scar. It was all as familiar as breathing. The farmhouse sat on 43 acres, most of it dense woodland that my grandfather had never bothered to clear. He'd always said the trees were good for keeping the wind down and the soil from washing away during the spring rains. My grandmother used to warn me about going too deep into the woods alone, but she worried about everything. Snakes, wild hogs, getting lost, breaking an ankle in a hidden hole. Normal dangers that any country kid learns to navigate. That day felt different from the moment I stepped off the back porch. The air hung thick and still, unusual for late afternoon when the breeze typically picked up. Even the insects seemed muted, their usual symphony reduced to an occasional chirp or buzz. I chalked it up to the heat. It had been hovering around 98 degrees for 3 straight days, the kind of weather that makes everything sluggish and strange. I followed my usual route, past the old chicken coop that hadn't housed birds in 20 years, around the massive stump where my grandfather used to split firewood, and into the tree line where the path became less defined. My sneakers crunched through the carpet of dead leaves and pine needles, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. Usually I found the solitude peaceful, but something about the oppressive silence made my skin crawl. About 10 minutes into my walk, I called out, "Mom!" just to break the quiet, even though I knew she was back at the house helping my grandmother with dinner preparations. My voice seemed to get swallowed by the trees, producing no echo, no response from the wildlife. It was as if the sound just died the moment it left my mouth. The unease started then, creeping up my spine like cold fingers. I'd spent hundreds of hours in these woods and never felt anything like this. A sense of being watched, of the very air around me holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just on edge from the stress of recent life changes. Dropping out of school, disappointing my parents, having no clear direction for my future, it was enough to make anyone paranoid. But as I continued deeper into the woods, following the familiar path toward the creek, the feeling intensified. The shadows seemed darker than they should have been, stretching in directions that didn't match the sun's position. Every rustle of leaves made me turn my head, expecting to see a squirrel or bird, but finding nothing. The ordinary sounds I'd grown up with, the crack of settling wood, the scurry of small animals through underbrush, now carried an ominous weight. I was about a quarter mile from the house when I heard it the first time. My name, called in what sounded like my mother's voice, but stretched and distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. It came from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the woods, which made no sense. My mother had been in the kitchen when I left, and she never ventured this far into the trees. "Mom?" I called back, stopping in the middle of the path. "Is that you? Do you need help?" Silence. Not even the sound of footsteps moving away or toward me. Just that oppressive, unnatural quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I stood there for what felt like minutes, scanning the trees ahead, looking for any sign of movement. The logical part of my brain supplied reasonable explanations. Maybe it was a neighbor calling their dog. Maybe the heat was affecting my hearing. Maybe I was more stressed than I realized. But something primal in my gut told me to turn around and head back to the house. I'd learned to trust that instinct during my years exploring these woods. It had kept me from stepping on copperheads, warned me away from unstable ground near the creek, alerted me to the presence of the occasional wild hog. Now it was screaming at me to leave, to get back to safety, to not investigate that voice any further. I should have listened. Instead of heeding my instincts, I took 3 more steps down the path. That's when I heard it again. My name. But this time the voice carried a quality that made my stomach clench. It was my mother's voice, I was certain of that, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too high in some syllables, too low in others, like someone trying to imitate her speech patterns without quite getting it right. "Where are you?" the voice called. And now I could tell it was coming from behind a cluster of pine trees about 50 yards ahead. "I need to show you something." My mother had never said those words to me before, at least not in that tone. When she needed to show me something, she'd call me into the kitchen or living room, not lure me deeper into the woods with cryptic messages. The wrongness of it hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my heart rate spike. "Mom, where exactly are you?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "This isn't funny." No response, but now I could hear something else. A rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush, but moving wrong. Too slow, too deliberate, with pauses that lasted too long between steps. A person walking through woods makes a certain rhythm of sounds. Footfalls, brush being pushed aside, the occasional snap of a twig. This was different. It sounded like something large dragging itself forward, stopping periodically as if listening. I backed up 2 steps, my rational mind warring with a growing sense of panic. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank, though that seemed unlikely given our remote location. Maybe there was an injured hiker in the woods who needed help. Maybe my mother really had followed me and was having some kind of medical episode that was affecting her speech. But even as I ran through these possibilities, my body was preparing to run. My muscles tensed, my breathing became shallow, and sweat that had nothing to do with the heat began forming on my forehead. Every survival instinct I possessed was firing at once, flooding my system with adrenaline. The rustling sound grew closer, and with it came something else, a smell. It was faint at first, almost masked by the normal forest sense of decomposing leaves and pine sap. But as it grew stronger, I recognized it as something organic and wrong. Not the clean smell of a healthy animal or person, but something that reminded me of roadkill that had been sitting in the sun too long, or the time a raccoon had died in our attic and we didn't find it for a week. "Come closer," the voice called again, and this time I was certain it wasn't my mother. The pitch was all wrong, and there was an undertone to it that sounded like vocal cords that weren't quite human trying to form human words. "I found something you need to see." I took another step backward, then another. Whatever was in those trees ahead of me, it wasn't my mother, wasn't a neighbor, wasn't any person I'd ever encountered. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe someone with a severe speech impediment, maybe a recording being played through a speaker, maybe auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and heat. But the smell was getting stronger, and underneath the rustling, I could now hear what sounded like labored breathing. Heavy, wet, with a quality that suggested damaged lungs or throat. It was the kind of breathing you might hear from someone who'd been a heavy smoker for decades, but amplified and distorted. That's when I saw the first glimpse of movement between the trees. Something tall and pale, moving with an unnatural gait that seemed to involve too many joints bending in the wrong directions. It was still partially obscured by the pine branches, but what I could see made my vision blur around the edges with the beginnings of panic. The thing was roughly human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with skin that looked mottled and damaged, like it had been burned or diseased. What I had initially taken for clothing appeared to be more skin, hanging in loose folds that swayed as it moved. And its proportions were all off. Arms that hung too low, a neck that seemed too long, hands that ended in what looked like darkened, overgrown fingernails. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked up as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The thing emerged further from behind the trees, and I got a clearer view of its face. It was the worst part, vaguely human features arranged in a configuration that sent waves of revulsion through me. The eyes were too large and set too far apart, with no visible whites, just dark pupils that seemed to reflect the fading sunlight like an animal's. The mouth was wrong too, stretched too wide and filled with teeth that were too pointed, too numerous, overlapping each other like they'd grown in without any pattern or purpose. But it was moving toward me with purpose, not shambling randomly like a sick animal. Its gait was deliberate, calculated, and there was an intelligence in those dark eyes that was somehow worse than if it had just been a mindless predator. This thing was thinking, planning, evaluating me as it approached. The smell intensified as it got closer, and I could now identify other components mixed in with the decay. Something metallic like old blood, something chemical like cleaning fluid, and underneath it all, something that reminded me of the smell that clings to your hands after handling raw meat that's just starting to turn. "Don't run," it said in my mother's voice, but now I could see that the words weren't coming from a mouth that could properly form them. The lips moved wrong, the tongue wasn't the right color, and there was a wet, clicking sound accompanying each syllable. "I have something wonderful to show you." My paralysis broke like a snapped cable. I spun around and ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through branches and underbrush without any concern for the path. Behind me I could hear it following, but not running, making that same deliberate rustling movement, as if it knew I couldn't escape and saw no need to hurry. The woods seemed to have changed around me. Paths I'd known for years no longer led where they should. Trees I'd climbed as a child appeared to have moved, blocking routes that should have been clear. The shadows had deepened despite the sun still being visible through the canopy, and every direction looked the same, dense, dark, and threatening. I could hear my own panicked breathing, the crash of my footsteps through the undergrowth, the hammering of my heart in my ears. But underneath all of that, I could still hear the thing behind me, moving with that horrible patience, occasionally calling my name in voices that belonged to people I knew, but twisted into something obscene. My grandmother's voice. "Where are you going, sweetie?" My grandfather's voice. "Come back here, boy." My father's voice. "Don't make me come find you." Each one perfect in tone and inflection, but wrong in context and timing, like someone had recorded conversations and was playing them back at inappropriate moments. The thing was learning the voices of my family, collecting them somehow, and using them against me. I stumbled over a root and went down hard, scraping my palms and knees on the rough ground. As I scrambled to get back up, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The thing was maybe 30 yards behind me, moving through the trees with an ease that suggested it knew these woods better than I did. It wasn't hurrying because it didn't need to. I was running blind through terrain it had mapped out long before I arrived. When I looked at it directly, more details became horribly clear. Its skin wasn't just pale and damaged. It was covered in what looked like surgical scars, precise lines that crisscrossed its torso and limbs like a medical diagram. Some of the scars were old and healed, while others appeared fresh, still seeping a dark fluid that stained the loose folds of skin around them. Its hair was sparse and grew in irregular patches, some areas completely bald, while others had long, stringy strands that moved independent of any breeze. And its hands. God, its hands were the worst part. The fingers were too long and ended in what I had initially mistaken for overgrown nails, but now realized were something else entirely. They looked surgical, metallic, like instruments that had been grafted onto human bones. I forced myself to look away and concentrate on running, but the image was burned into my mind. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It looked like something that had been constructed, assembled from parts that were never meant to go together. The surgical scars suggested someone had been experimenting, modifying, improving on some basic design in ways that violated every law of biology and decency. The thought that a human being might have created this thing was almost worse than believing it was some unknown species. At least a monster born from nature might have some comprehensible motivation: hunger, territory, reproduction. But something made by human hands implied a purpose that was purely malevolent, created for the sake of causing suffering. I reached a small clearing I recognized and oriented myself toward the house. I was still about half a mile away, but I could run that distance if I could just maintain my pace and avoid falling again. The thing behind me had fallen silent, which was somehow worse than hearing it move. At least when I could track its position, I knew where the threat was coming from. The silence stretched on as I ran, broken only by my own labored breathing and the sound of my feet hitting the ground. I began to hope that maybe I'd lost it, that maybe it had given up the chase and returned to whatever hole it had crawled out of. But just as I was starting to feel a glimmer of relief, I heard my own voice calling out from somewhere ahead of me. "Help me! Someone help me!" It was my voice, perfect in every detail, coming from the direction I was running. The thing had somehow gotten ahead of me, and now it was using my own voice to try to lure my family into the woods. The thought of my grandmother or grandfather hearing what they thought was me calling for help and venturing into these trees made my stomach lurch with panic. I veered to the right, abandoning the direct path home in favor of a longer route that would keep me away from wherever the thing was positioned. But as soon as I changed direction, I heard my voice again, this time from my new heading. "I'm hurt. I can't walk. Please help me." It was moving with me, staying ahead of my position, using my voice to create an expanding perimeter of false distress calls. And they were convincing. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed someone was genuinely in trouble. The thing had somehow learned not just the sound of my voice, but the emotional patterns, the way I would actually sound if I were injured and scared. I stopped running and tried to think. The thing was faster than me and knew the woods better than I did. It could apparently move silently when it wanted to, and it was intelligent enough to use psychological warfare. Running blindly wasn't going to work. I needed a strategy. The farmhouse had several outbuildings, a barn, a tool shed, an old root cellar that my grandfather had dug in the 1960s. If I could reach one of them, I might be able to hide until someone came looking for me, or at least put a solid barrier between myself and whatever was hunting me. I chose the barn as my destination. It was sturdy, had multiple exit points, and contained tools that could potentially be used as weapons. More importantly, it was visible from the house, so if the thing followed me there, my family would be more likely to notice something was wrong. I started moving again, but more carefully this time, trying to stay quiet and avoid the obvious paths. The thing seemed to have anticipated this strategy, because I could hear my voice calling out from multiple directions now, creating a chorus of false distress calls that would confuse anyone trying to locate the real me. "I'm lost. I can't find my way back. Something bit me. I think it was a snake. I fell in the creek. The current is too strong." Each call was perfectly crafted to inspire immediate action from anyone who heard it. My grandmother would come running with the first aid kit. My grandfather would grab his shotgun and his flashlight. My mother would call 911. The thing was trying to draw them all into the woods, where it could do to them whatever it had planned for me. I had to get to the house and warn them before they heard these calls and came looking for me. But every time I tried to move toward home, the voices would shift to block my path, always staying just ahead of me, always calling out in that perfect imitation of my distressed voice. After 20 minutes of this deadly game of cat and mouse, I finally saw the barn through the trees. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Weathered red wood, rusted tin roof, the big sliding door slightly ajar the way my grandfather always left it. Normal. Safe. A refuge from the nightmare that was pursuing me through the woods. I sprinted the last 100 yards, burst through the gap in the sliding door, and immediately started looking for something to bar it shut. The barn was filled with the usual collection of farm equipment, old furniture, and decades of accumulated junk that my grandfather couldn't bring himself to throw away. I grabbed a heavy workbench and dragged it in front of the door, then piled several bags of feed on top of it for extra weight. Only then did I allow myself to stop and catch my breath. The barn smelled like hay and motor oil and old wood, normal smells that helped ground me in reality after the horror in the woods. I could see the house through the window, warm light spilling from the kitchen where my family was probably wondering where I'd gone for so long. I needed to get to them and warn them about the voices they might hear. But I also needed a weapon in case the thing followed me. I looked around the barn and found my grandfather's old deer rifle hanging on the wall. I'd used it before during hunting season, so I knew how to load and fire it. There was a box of ammunition on the shelf below it. As I loaded the rifle, I tried to make sense of what I'd encountered. The thing in the woods wasn't like anything I'd ever heard of, even in the wildest urban legends or horror stories. It was too sophisticated, too purposeful, too obviously artificial. Someone had made it, which meant someone knew it existed, knew what it was capable of. But who? And why? And why here in these particular woods that I'd considered safe for so many years? I was still puzzling over these questions when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. My own voice, calling out from just outside the barn. "Grandpa? Grandma? I'm in the barn. Something's wrong with my leg." The voice was coming from the other side of the sliding door, maybe 10 feet away. The thing had followed me here, and now it was trying to lure my family into a trap. I could see the house through the window, could see movement in the kitchen, could imagine my grandfather reaching for his coat and flashlight to come help his injured grandson. I had to warn them, but I couldn't leave the barn without encountering the thing directly. And I couldn't call out to the house because my voice would be indistinguishable from the fake calls the thing was making. "I think I broke something," my voice called out again. "It really hurts. Can someone come help me?" The performance was flawless. If I didn't know better, I would have believed it myself. The thing had somehow learned not just my voice, but my speech patterns, my vocabulary, even the way I would phrase a request for help. It was like listening to a recording of myself that I didn't remember making. Through the window, I saw the kitchen light go out and the back porch light come on. Someone was coming. I had to do something. I moved to the window and started waving frantically, trying to signal that something was wrong. But the person coming out of the house, it looked like my grandfather, was heading toward the sound of the voice, not looking in my direction. "Grandpa," I shouted through the glass. "Don't come out here, it's not me." But the window was old and thick, and I don't think he heard me clearly. He kept walking toward the barn, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the ground. The false calls continued, guiding him closer to whatever trap the thing had prepared. I had to make a choice. I could stay hidden in the barn and hope my grandfather would figure out something was wrong before it was too late. Or I could go out there and face the thing directly, maybe buy my grandfather time to get back to the house safely. I chose the latter. I checked the rifle one more time, made sure the safety was off, and moved toward the door. If the thing wanted me, it could have me. But it wasn't going to get my family. I moved the workbench aside as quietly as possible and slipped out through the gap in the door, The thing was standing about 20 feet away, positioned between me and my grandfather, who was still approaching with his flashlight. In the artificial light, the thing looked even more grotesque than it had in the woods. Its skin had a waxy, translucent quality that revealed dark veins underneath. The surgical scars I'd noticed before were more extensive than I'd realized, covering almost every inch of its body in precise, geometric patterns. It stood perfectly still, like a mannequin, but its head was turned toward my grandfather, tracking his approach. "I'm over here," I shouted, raising the rifle. "Grandpa, get back to the house, now!" My grandfather's flashlight beam swung toward me, and I saw his face change as he realized there were two of us, one calling from near the woods, one holding a gun by the barn. The confusion lasted only a second before his expression shifted to understanding and alarm. "Get inside," I yelled again. "Call the police." The thing turned toward me, and I got my first clear look at its face in artificial light. It was worse than I'd imagined. The features were human enough to be recognizable, but wrong enough to trigger every revulsion response in my brain. The eyes weren't just large and dark. They were compound like an insect's, made up of hundreds of smaller lenses that reflected the flashlight beam. The mouth was filled with what I'd thought were too many teeth, but now I could see they weren't teeth at all. They were needles. Thin metal spikes arranged in concentric circles like the inside of some nightmare machine. "You found me," it said in my voice, but now I could see how it was making the sound. Its throat distended and contracted like a bellows, forcing air through chambers that weren't designed for human speech. The mouth moved randomly, unconnected to the words being produced. "I've been waiting for you." I fired the rifle. The bullet caught its center mass, spinning it around and spraying dark fluid across the ground. But instead of falling, it straightened up and looked down at the wound with what I can only describe as mild interest. The hole in its chest was already beginning to close, the edges pulling together like the thing was made of some self-repairing material. "That stung," it said, still using my voice. The mouth had stopped moving entirely now, but the words kept coming, emanating from somewhere inside its torso. "Do it again." I fired twice more, both shots hitting center mass. The thing staggered, but didn't fall. The wounds sealed themselves within seconds, leaving only dark stains on its mottled skin. Whatever it was made of, conventional weapons weren't going to stop it. Behind me, I could hear my grandfather shouting into his phone, calling 911, describing an intruder on the property. But what was he going to tell them? That his grandson was being threatened by something that looked like a medical experiment gone wrong? That bullets passed through it without effect? That it could perfectly mimic human voices? The thing started walking toward me, moving with that same deliberate, patient gait I'd seen in the woods. Each step was measured, calculated, like it was in no hurry because it knew the outcome was inevitable. "You can't hurt me," it said in my grandmother's voice now. "But I can hurt you. I can hurt all of you." I backed toward the barn, keeping the rifle raised even though I knew it was useless. The thing followed, closing the distance between us with each step. Behind it, I could see my grandfather running back toward the house, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he moved. "What do you want?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I want to play," it replied in a child's voice I didn't recognize. "I want to learn. I want to practice." Practice what? Being human. Now it was using my father's voice. "It's harder than it looks. So many small details to get right. The way you move your mouth when you talk. The way your eyes track movement. The way you breathe when you're afraid." As it spoke, I noticed its movements were becoming more fluid, more natural. It was learning from watching me, adapting its behavior in real time. The awkward, mechanical gait was smoothing out into something that could almost pass for human from a distance. "I've been practicing for a long time," it continued, Cycling through voices I recognized: my mother, my grandfather, my high school teacher, friends from college. But I've never had such good subjects to study. Your family is very expressive, very emotional, very easy to read. The implication hit me like a physical blow. This thing had been watching us, studying us, learning our voices and mannerisms. For how long? Days, weeks, years? How long have you been here? I asked. Long enough, it said in my grandmother's voice. Long enough to know all your routines, all your habits, all your fear. It was close enough now that I could smell it clearly. That mixture of decay and chemicals and something else. Something surgical and sterile. Close enough to see that its skin wasn't just scarred, but tattooed with symbols I didn't recognize. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. What are you? I whispered, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The thing paused its advance and tilted its head, considering the question. When it spoke again, it used a voice I didn't recognize. Flat, electronic, like a computer trying to simulate human speech. I am an experiment, it said. A prototype, a proof of concept. For what? Replacement, infiltration, improvement. The voice remained mechanical, emotionless. Humans are flawed, inefficient, prone to error and emotion and weakness. I am designed to be better. Who made you? People who understand that evolution is too slow, that waiting for natural selection to improve the species is wasteful. People who have the vision and the resources to accelerate the process. As it spoke, I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. My grandfather's call to 911 had worked. But what were the police going to do against something that could heal from gunshot wounds? The first prototypes were crude, the thing continued, seemingly unconcerned about the approaching sirens. Barely functional, but each iteration improved. Better healing, better mimicry, better adaptation. How many of you are there? Enough. We are placed in rural communities for field testing, to study human behavior in controlled environments, to perfect our disguises before deployment in larger population centers. The casual way it described this made my stomach turn. We weren't people to this thing. We were test subjects, lab rats being studied in a maze. And there were others like it, scattered in small towns and rural areas across the country, learning to be human so they could eventually replace us. What happens when you perfect the disguise? Integration. Replacement. The inefficient models are retired. Retired? Eliminated. The sirens were getting closer, maybe a mile away now. I could see flashing lights through the trees. But the thing showed no sign of concern, no indication that it planned to flee or hide. You're not afraid of the police? Why would I be? They will see what I want them to see, hear what I want them to hear. They have no protocols for dealing with something like me. It was right, and we both knew it. What were small-town police officers going to make of this situation? Even if they believed my grandfather's story, even if they saw the thing clearly, they had no training or equipment for dealing with something that could survive multiple gunshot wounds and perfectly mimic human voices. Besides, the thing added, its voice shifting back to my own, I have learned everything I need from this community. My mission here is complete. Mission, data collection, behavioral analysis, infiltration testing. I have successfully integrated into your social structure, learned your communication patterns, and identified the optimal methods for replacement. My mind raced, trying to understand what it was telling me. Had this thing been living among us, replacing people? How many of our neighbors, our friends, our family members were actually these prototypes? Who have you replaced? I asked. The thing smiled, and for the first time, the expression looked genuinely human. That was the most terrifying thing yet. Not its monstrous appearance, but the moment when it looked almost normal. "No one yet," it said. "But I have identified the optimal targets. People who live alone. People who have minimal social connections. People whose disappearance would take time to notice." It gestured toward the approaching police cars. Like rural police officers who patrol alone at night. The implication hit me like a sledgehammer. This thing wasn't planning to run from the police. It was planning to add them to its collection of voices and identities. It would study them, learn their mannerisms, and then replace them. And who would question a police officer who started acting slightly differently? Who would suspect that their local law enforcement had been replaced by something designed to infiltrate and eliminate human communities? "You can't stop this," the thing said, reading my expression. "This is just the beginning. We are everywhere now. In your schools, your hospitals, your government buildings. Learning, adapting, preparing." The police cars pulled into the driveway, their headlights illuminating the space between the barn and the house. I could see officers getting out, drawing their weapons, calling for backup. Standard procedure for a reported home invasion. The thing looked at them with interest, like a scientist observing a new species of insect. Then it did something that made my knees weak with terror. It changed. Its appearance shifted like water, the monstrous features smoothing out, the surgical scars fading, the unnaturally pale skin darkening to a normal human tone. Within seconds, it looked like a perfectly ordinary person, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. "Thank you for the demonstration," it said in a voice I didn't recognize, but that sounded completely human. "Your fear responses were very instructive." The police found me standing by the barn holding an empty rifle, staring at a man in his 30s who claimed to be a lost hiker. He explained that he'd been calling for help for hours, that he'd gotten turned around in the woods and was trying to find his way back to the main road. He was articulate, calm, and completely convincing. I tried to tell them what had really happened, but my story sounded insane even to me. A shape-shifting monster that could mimic voices? Surgical scars that healed instantly? A conspiracy to replace human beings with artificial duplicates? The officers looked at me with the mixture of concern and skepticism that cops reserve for people having mental health crises. The hiker was sympathetic and understanding. He suggested that I might have been startled by his calls for help and let my imagination run wild in the darkness. He even volunteered to come back another time to make a formal statement, to make sure there were no hard feelings about the misunderstanding. My grandfather backed up my story as best he could, but he'd only seen the end of the encounter, and in the poor lighting, he couldn't be certain of the details. The police took our statements, walked the property with flashlights, and found nothing out of the ordinary. No physical evidence of the creature I'd described. No blood where I'd shot it. No signs of a struggle. The hiker left with them, riding in the back of a patrol car to town where he claimed his vehicle was parked. I watched through the window as the car drove away, and I could swear that in the brief moment before the interior light went out, I saw him looking back at the house with those two large, too dark eyes. That was 3 years ago. I moved away from Texas shortly after, claiming I needed to finish my education. I never went back to my grandparents' farm. I couldn't sleep in those woods again, couldn't walk those familiar paths without wondering what was watching me from the shadows. But leaving didn't help. No matter where I go, I find myself studying faces in crowds, listening for voices that sound just slightly wrong, watching for people who move or speak or behave in ways that seem almost but not quite human. I've learned to recognize the signs, the too perfect posture, the eyes that track movement like cameras, the subtle delays in emotional responses. They're everywhere now, just like the thing told me they would be. Teachers who never seem to age or get sick. Police officers who patrol the same routes with mechanical precision. Store clerks who remember every customer's purchase history but never engage in spontaneous conversation. They're good at their disguises now, but not perfect. Not yet. I've tried to tell people what I know, but who would believe it? Who would take seriously a story about artificial beings designed to replace humanity? Even I sometimes wonder if I've lost my mind. If the stress of that night broke something in my brain that causes me to see threats where none exist. But then I'll catch someone staring at me too intently, or I'll hear a voice that's too perfect, too practiced, and I'll know that I'm not crazy. I'll know that somewhere in a laboratory, scientists are still working to perfect their prototypes. I'll know that the thing in the woods was telling the truth about what was coming. The worst part is the waiting. Knowing that one day, one of them will complete its mission successfully. Knowing that the people I care about, my family, my friends, my neighbors, might already be gone, replaced by things that wear their faces and speak in their voices, while something fundamentally human has been lost forever. I still live with the fear that I brought to their attention that night, that by encountering one of their prototypes, by surviving long enough to understand what it was, I marked myself as a threat that needs to be eliminated. I change apartments frequently, vary my routines, avoid forming close relationships with anyone who might be used against me. But I also live with the knowledge that I might be the only person who knows the truth about what's happening to our species. The only one who saw behind the mask and lived to tell about it. The only one who can warn others about what's coming, even if no one wants to listen. Sometimes I wonder if that was part of their plan all along. To let me escape. To let me spread a story so outrageous that anyone who hears it will dismiss it as the ravings of a paranoid mind. What better way to discredit the truth than to make it sound like a conspiracy theory? But I keep telling the story anyway, to anyone who will listen. Because somewhere out there, in small towns and rural communities across the country, other people might be having encounters like mine. Other people might be seeing things that don't quite fit, hearing voices that sound almost but not quite right, sensing that something fundamental about their world has changed. And maybe, if enough of us speak up, if enough of us pay attention, we can figure out how to fight back before it's too late. Before the replacement process is complete. Before the last truly human voice is silenced forever, leaving only perfect mimics speaking words they learned from studying our fear. The thing in the woods was right about one thing. This is just the beginning. But it was wrong about another thing. We can stop this. We have to stop this. Because the alternative is a world where humanity exists only as a collection of behavioral patterns, copied and reproduced by things that understand our mannerisms, but not our souls. I've spent 3 years looking over my shoulder, 3 years jumping at shadows, 3 years wondering if today will be the day they come to finish what they started in those Texas woods. But I've also spent 3 years learning, preparing, watching for signs of their presence in the world around me. And now I'm ready to fight back. Because whatever they are, wherever they came from, however they were made, they made one critical error in their design. They can copy our voices, mimic our movements, replicate our social behaviors. But they can't reproduce the one thing that makes us truly human. Our willingness to sacrifice everything to protect the people we love. That's a lesson they're going to learn the hard way. The trail disappeared 3 miles back. What remained was a faint game path winding through towering ponderosa pines, their bark glowing amber in the late afternoon sun. My boots crunched over a carpet of pine needles as I checked my GPS again. The Navajo National Forest stretched for miles in every direction, and according to my waypoints, I was still on track for the remote alpine lake where I planned to camp for the next 5 nights. I'd chosen this particular section of the Chuska Mountains specifically for its isolation. After 15 years of desk work at the same accounting firm in Phoenix, I needed something real, something visceral to shock my system back to life. The rangers at the visitor center had strongly advised against solo hiking in this region, especially off-trail. People get turned around real easy up there, the older ranger had warned, his weathered face creasing with concern. And we've had unusual wildlife activity this season. When pressed, He explained that several hikers had reported being stalked by what they thought was a large predator. Maybe a mountain lion, maybe something else. Locals don't go up there after dark, he'd added in a lower voice. Not since the incidents. I should have listened. The late July heat was oppressive, even at 9,000 feet. My pack dug into my shoulders, 35 pounds of gear shifting with each step. According to my map, the lake sat in a small valley just below the tree line, nestled between two jagged peaks. I'd been hiking for nearly 7 hours, and my legs were beginning to protest. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the forest shadows lengthened and merged. I needed to find a suitable camping spot before darkness fell completely. The trail, if you could still call it that, ascended steeply through a dense section of forest. The trees here grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead like gnarled fingers. I froze at a sharp crack behind me, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking underfoot. Turning slowly, I scanned the forest but saw nothing except shadows and trees. Probably just a deer, I reasoned, though my heart rate had doubled in an instant. 20 minutes later, I reached a small clearing that seemed suitable for camping. A flat area about 30 feet in diameter, ringed by sturdy pines with good visibility in all directions. I shrugged off my pack and began setting up my tent, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. As I hammered the last tent stake into the rocky soil, I noticed something odd. An unusual silence had fallen over the forest. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds. Just stillness and the pounding of my own heart. Anyone who spends time in the wilderness knows this silence is often a warning. I quickly gathered firewood, building a robust campfire as the last light faded from the sky. The flames provided both warmth and psychological comfort as full darkness enveloped the mountain. Stars appeared overhead in dazzling clusters, the Milky Way a brilliant smear across the black canvas of night. While preparing my freeze-dried meal, I heard it again. The crack of a branch, this time closer to camp. I grabbed my headlamp, sweeping its beam through the trees surrounding the clearing. The light caught something at the forest's edge, 2 pinpoints of reflection about 6 feet off the ground. Eyes. They blinked once and vanished. I grabbed my hunting knife, the only weapon I'd brought, and stood motionless by the fire. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding pathetically small in the vast darkness. "Is someone there?" No response came except the crackling of my campfire. I convinced myself it must have been a deer or elk, though something about those eyes, their height from the ground, their spacing, suggested otherwise. That night, I slept fitfully inside my tent, waking at every sound. Around 3 a.m., I jolted awake to a noise I couldn't immediately identify. Something between a whistle and a moan, carrying through the mountain air from some indeterminate distance. It rose and fell in pitch, almost like speech but not quite human. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the sound itself, but what happened next. Responses came from different directions, similar vocalizations answering the first call. They continued for nearly 5 minutes before silence returned. I lay awake until dawn, knife clutched in my hand, questioning my decision to seek solitude in these mountains. Morning arrived with merciful sunlight and birdsong. The forest seemed ordinary again, the nocturnal anxieties fading with the darkness. I emerged from my tent stiff and exhausted, determined to continue to the lake as planned. Rational explanations existed for everything I'd experienced. Mountain lions were known to make unusual vocalizations, and many animals hunted at night. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, I broke camp and shouldered my pack. That's when I noticed them. Tracks in the soft soil at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by fallen pine needles. They resembled canine prints but were far too large, nearly 5 inches across, and the stride length suggested something with legs much longer than any wolf or coyote. More unsettling was their pattern, They circled my entire campsite in a deliberate manner, as if whatever made them had been pacing around my tent while I slept. I photographed the prints with my phone, then continued toward the lake, pushing the pace faster than planned. The trail grew steeper, winding through boulder fields and stands of aspen. By midday, I reached a high ridge that offered the first view of my destination, a pristine alpine lake, its surface a perfect mirror reflecting the surrounding peaks. The sight momentarily erased my uneasiness. I took several photos and began descending toward the shoreline, reaching it an hour later. The lake occupied a natural bowl in the mountains, surrounded by steep slopes on 3 sides. The only approach was the way I'd come, through the forest below. I found an ideal camping spot beneath a stand of white pines, about 30 yards from the water's edge. With several hours of daylight remaining, I established camp, gathered firewood, and filtered water from the lake. This location felt safer, more open, with better visibility, and the reassuring presence of water. While setting up my tent, I discovered something lodged in the side pocket of my backpack, a small bundle of twigs bound together with what looked like strands of hair. I hadn't placed it there. It resembled the witches' ladders I'd seen in a documentary about folklore, supposed protective charms used by various cultures. Someone must have slipped it into my pack at the visitor center or trailhead as a prank. I tossed it into the lake and watched it float away. That afternoon, I hiked the perimeter of the lake, taking photographs and enjoying the alpine scenery. On the far side, partially hidden behind a fallen tree, I discovered the remnants of a previous campsite, an old fire ring containing charred bones and a torn piece of fabric that might once have been part of a tent or sleeping bag. More disturbing was what I found scratched into a nearby tree trunk, a crude symbol resembling a stick figure with an elongated head or perhaps antlers. Below it, someone had carved the words, "They come at night." I dismissed it as the work of teenagers or bored hikers trying to scare others. Nevertheless, I returned to my camp earlier than planned and built a larger fire than necessary. As sunset approached, I noticed dark clouds building over the western peaks. A summer storm was rolling in, bringing with it gusting winds that bent the treetops and rippled the lake's surface. Perfect timing. Just what I needed to compound the growing sense of isolation. I secured my tent with additional stakes and gathered extra firewood, hoping to maintain a fire through the night despite the approaching rain. The first distant rumble of thunder came as dusk gathered, followed by flashes of lightning illuminating the cloud base. While organizing gear inside my tent, I discovered my satellite phone was missing. I distinctly remembered packing it in the top compartment of my backpack, but it was gone. Without it, I had no way to contact the outside world. My regular cell phone showed no service as expected in this remote location. The storm arrived with startling intensity. Sheets of rain hammering the tent while lightning strikes cracked across the sky. My fire hissed and died despite my efforts to shield it. With darkness came that same unnatural silence I'd noticed the previous night, even amid the storm's fury. Between thunderclaps, I heard something moving outside. Heavy footsteps circling my tent, too deliberate to be an animal seeking shelter. I called out, thinking another hiker might have been caught in the storm, but received no answer. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent door. I held my breath, knife ready, as a shadow fell across the tent wall. The silhouette of something roughly human-shaped but wrong somehow, too tall and oddly proportioned. Lightning flashed, and I glimpsed its distorted outline through the tent fabric, standing upright but hunched, with what appeared to be an elongated head. When the next lightning bolt struck, the shadow was gone. I spent that night huddled in my sleeping bag, jumping at every sound, convincing myself that lack of sleep and the storm were causing me to imagine things. Yet when morning came and I finally dozed off from exhaustion, I dreamed of being watched by something ancient and patient, something that knew these mountains long before humans arrived. The storm cleared overnight, leaving a brilliant blue sky and freshly washed landscape. I emerged from my tent intending to photograph the lake at dawn, only to find my camera lens smashed. The protective case cracked open as if stepped on, though I was certain I'd stored it safely inside my tent vestibule. More alarming were the tracks, the same oversized canine prints from before, but now they led directly to and from my tent. Interspersed among them were others that appeared almost human, but with elongated toe marks and unusual depth distribution suggesting an unnatural gait. I couldn't rationalize this away. Something, or someone, had been at my campsite during the night. If this was a prank by other hikers, it had gone too far. If not, I pushed that thought aside. Without my satellite phone, I had limited options. I could hike out immediately, but that meant traveling through the dense forest where I'd heard those strange calls. The alternative was to continue with my planned exploration of the alpine ridges above the lake, hoping to find either cell service or another group of hikers. I chose the ridgeline, reasoning that higher ground offered better visibility and potential communication. I packed essential gear into my day pack, hiding my main backpack and tent beneath pine branches. The idea of leaving my shelter behind was unsettling, but I needed mobility. The climb was steeper than anticipated. What looked like a moderate slope from the lake revealed itself to be a challenging ascent requiring both hiking and scrambling techniques. By midday, I reached the ridge, nearly 11,000 feet above sea level. The view was spectacular, mountains extending to the horizon in all directions, no signs of human development visible anywhere. My cell phone remained without service. The ridge continued for several miles, connecting two higher peaks. I followed it eastward, hoping the higher elevation might offer connectivity. The terrain was exposed, with little vegetation beyond hardy alpine grasses and occasional stunted pines twisted by constant wind. Around 2 p.m., I discovered something unexpected. A small stone structure resembling a shepherd's hut built into the lee side of a rock outcropping. Its walls were constructed of flat stone stacked without mortar, topped by a partially collapsed roof of timber and more stone. The doorway gaped open, revealing a dark interior. Curiosity overcame caution. I approached the structure, calling out to announce my presence. When no response came, I peered inside. The hut contained a crude sleeping platform, an old fire pit, and surprisingly, recent evidence of occupation, a modern backpacking stove and torn sleeping bag. Written on the interior wall in what appeared to be charcoal were dozens of tally marks and a date from just 3 weeks earlier. Below these, in hurried handwriting, "It mimics voices. Don't trust what you hear." I backed out of the hut, suddenly aware of how exposed I was on the ridge. The sun had passed its zenith, and shadows were lengthening across the mountainside. I needed to return to the lake before dusk. Halfway down the slope, I heard someone calling my name. The voice was distant but clear, coming from the direction of my campsite. It called again, using my full name, information no one in this wilderness should know. I froze, remembering the warning in the hut. The voice called a third time, now tinged with distress, pleading for help. It sounded exactly like my brother, who lived 2,000 miles away in Boston. I continued downward, moving as quietly as possible, taking cover behind rocks and vegetation. As the lake came into view, I scanned the shoreline for any sign of movement. My campsite appeared undisturbed, but something dark floated in the center of the lake. Using my binoculars, I identified my backpack, the one I'd hidden at camp, now somehow in the middle of the lake. Even from this distance, I could see it had been torn open, its contents scattered across the water's surface. The voice called again, now from the forest behind my camp. Then another voice joined it. My mother's voice, though she had passed away 3 years earlier. I remained hidden until sunset, watching my campsite from the hillside, seeing nothing move. When darkness began to fall, I faced a terrible choice. Return to camp and face whatever waited there, or spend the night exposed on the mountainside without shelter or adequate warmth. The temperature was already dropping rapidly. Without proper gear, hypothermia was a real risk at this elevation. I had no choice but to retrieve my tent. As I approached the campsite in the fading light, I immediately saw that something was wrong. My tent remained where I'd left it, but the vestibule flap hung open, and the entrance had been torn, not cut, but ripped open with considerable force. Inside, my sleeping bag and remaining gear had been scattered. Deep scratches marked the tent floor, and a pungent, musky odor permeated everything, like wet dog combined with something rotten. I worked quickly, grabbing essential items and stuffing them into my day pack. Night had nearly fallen completely when I heard movement in the forest. Branches breaking under heavy weight, coming toward camp from multiple directions. I abandoned the tent and ran for the lakeshore, hoping water might offer some protection. Behind me, something large crashed through the underbrush. I spent that night perched in a tree. After fleeing my destroyed campsite, I'd circled the lake to its eastern shore, climbing a sturdy pine with low branches that offered relatively secure footing. From 20 feet up, I watched as multiple shadows moved through my former campsite, occasionally illuminated by the rising moon. They were roughly humanoid, but moved with an unnatural fluidity, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. I counted at least 3 distinct figures, communicating with those same eerie calls I'd heard the first night. One stood upright and seemed to be sniffing the air, turning its head methodically as if scanning for my scent. I remained motionless, controlling my breathing despite the cold that seeped into my limbs as the night progressed. The figures eventually dispersed into the surrounding forest, but I dared not descend until daylight. Dawn revealed a transformed landscape. Overnight fog had settled over the lake, reducing visibility to mere yards. I climbed down cautiously, muscles stiff from cold and inactivity. My priority was to find the trail back to civilization, but the fog made orientation difficult. I consulted my map and compass, establishing that the trailhead lay approximately 15 miles southeast. Even pushing hard, that meant at least one more night in the wilderness. Without my tent or sleeping bag, I'd need to find or create emergency shelter. The fog began to lift as I hiked along the lakeshore, revealing destruction at my campsite far worse than I'd initially thought. My tent had been shredded, its aluminum poles bent and twisted. Gear lay scattered in a 50-foot radius, much of it damaged beyond use. Most disturbing was a discovery near where my tent had stood. A small cairn of stones had been erected, topped with what appeared to be a deer skull. Fresh blood darkened the bone, dripping down to stain the rocks beneath. I photographed everything, then salvaged what remained useful. My water filter, first aid kit, some food, and my knife. My emergency fire starter was missing, as was my spare clothing. The trail back was overgrown but followable, descending steeply through the forest. I made good progress, despite frequent stops to listen for pursuit. By midday, I'd covered nearly 5 miles without incident, my confidence gradually returning with the sunshine and physical exertion. That confidence evaporated when I rounded a bend to find a fresh deer carcass in the middle of the trail. The animal had been killed recently, within hours, and displayed in a deliberate manner. Its body was intact, but positioned upright, balanced on its chest with legs splayed outward. The head was missing. I detoured widely around it, pushing through dense underbrush, rather than passing near the grisly marker. Whatever had killed the deer was sending a message. This was its territory, and I was an intruder. As afternoon waned, I located a suitable defensive position, a rock overhang creating a natural shelter, with a sheer cliff at my back and good visibility of the approaching slope. I gathered firewood and constructed a barrier of dead branches across the open side of my shelter. That's when I noticed the carvings. The rock face behind me bore dozens of petroglyphs, ancient images scratched into the stone surface. Most depicted stick figures of humans and animals, but one dominated the center. A tall, emaciated figure with an elongated head or headdress and disproportionately long limbs. Smaller human figures surrounded it in postures suggesting worship or fear. A modern addition had been carved below these ancient images, a crude rendering of the same symbol I'd seen by the lake, accompanied by a single word: Skinwalker. I'd heard stories about these beings from Native American mythology, humans who could transform into animals, malevolent shapeshifters that preyed on travelers. Rational thought insisted these were just legends embodying wilderness fears, but rational thought felt increasingly inadequate against my experiences. As sunset approached, I built the largest fire I could manage, creating a barrier of flames across the shelter's opening. I positioned rocks to reflect heat inward and gathered enough wood to last the night. Darkness fell with unnatural speed, as if the sun had been swallowed rather than set. My fire cast dancing shadows across the rock walls, making the ancient petroglyphs seem to move and shift. The moon rose, nearly full, bathing the forest below in silver light. From my elevated position, I could see much of the sloping terrain I'd traversed that day. Nothing moved within my line of sight, yet the feeling of being observed intensified with each passing hour. Around midnight, the calls began again. Those same not-quite-human vocalizations, now coming from multiple directions and clearly coordinated. One would sound, then another would answer from a different location, gradually moving closer to my position. I maintained the fire, knife in hand, watching the forest edge visible from my shelter. The moonlight created a patchwork of light and dark, perfect concealment for anything that knew how to use shadows. At approximately 1 a.m., I saw it clearly for the first time. A figure emerged from the tree line about 50 yards downslope from my position. It moved with an odd, loping gait, sometimes on two legs, sometimes dropping to all fours. In the moonlight, its skin appeared grayish and taut across an emaciated frame, its proportions wrong, limbs too long, joints bending in unnatural directions. Its head was the most disturbing feature, elongated and crowned with what might have been antlers or twisted branches. As it tilted its face upward toward my shelter, the firelight reflected in eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. It made no attempt to approach closer, instead pacing back and forth at the forest edge, occasionally stopping to raise its head and emit one of those chilling calls. Other calls answered from the darkness, but no other figures emerged into the moonlight. I remained absolutely still, maintaining the fire and watching until the figure finally retreated into the forest just before dawn. Only then did exhaustion overcome vigilance, and I fell into brief, fitful sleep. Morning brought both relief and urgency. I had approximately 10 miles remaining to the trailhead, a distance I could cover in one day if I maintained a fast pace. I abandoned everything non-essential, keeping only water, minimal food, my knife, and phone for documentation. The descent began smoothly enough. The main trail was more distinct at this lower elevation, and I made good progress through stands of pine and aspen. The forest seemed almost normal in daylight. Birds called, squirrels darted among branches, and occasional deer watched cautiously from the underbrush. Yet subtle wrongness persisted. I continued to find small bundles of bound sticks and hair placed at regular intervals along the trail, similar to what I'd found in my backpack. More disturbing were the occasional glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that vanished when directly observed. Around noon, I reached a stream crossing where the trail descended into a narrow ravine. The path ahead disappeared into dense forest, creating a natural bottleneck that raised immediate concerns. Something about the layout suggested an ambush point. I paused to consult my map, looking for an alternative route. The only option was a steep scramble up the ravine wall to bypass the bottleneck, rejoining the trail about half a mile further. It would be physically demanding, but strategically safer. The climb was treacherous, loose rock and soil giving way under my boots, forcing me to grab at tree roots and outcroppings for stability. Halfway up, I dislodged a large stone that crashed down into the ravine with a sound that seemed to echo for minutes. When I reached the top, breathing heavily from exertion, I realized my mistake. The noise had broadcast my location. I needed to move quickly. I bushwhacked through dense underbrush, parallel to where I estimated the trail ran below. The terrain was challenging, fallen logs, hidden sinkholes, and thorny vegetation slowing my progress. After 20 minutes of difficult travel, I found a game path leading roughly in the right direction. Following it brought me to a small clearing where I stopped abruptly, confronted by a sight that defied explanation. In the center of the clearing stood a crude structure, a framework of branches lashed together with sinew, forming a rough teepee shape about 7 feet tall. Hanging from this framework were dozens of small animal skulls, feathers, and bundles of dried herbs. The ground around it had been cleared in a perfect circle, the soil raked in spiral patterns. Most disturbing were the photographs pinned to the structure, weather-beaten images of different people, all appearing to be hikers or campers. Some faces had been scratched out, others were circled in what looked like dried blood. Among them was a photograph of me, taken from a distance as I set up camp by the lake on my first day. I hadn't seen anyone else on the mountain. No one should have been there to take that picture. I backed away slowly, then turned to run, directly into the chest of a man standing silently behind me. I recoiled with a shout, raising my knife defensively, but he made no aggressive move. He appeared to be in his 60s, with weathered Native American features and gray-streaked hair tied back. He wore modern hiking clothes and carried a walking staff. "You shouldn't be here," he said simply, his voice gravelly but human. "None of you should come to this place." He identified himself as a local guide and former park ranger who patrolled these mountains regularly. He'd been tracking me since I entered the region, along with the others. "What others?" I demanded, still holding my knife. "The things that hunt in these mountains," he replied. "The ones your people call skinwalkers. We have different names." He explained that the region had always been forbidden territory in his tribe's traditions, a place where the boundary between worlds thinned, allowing passage of entities that wore flesh but weren't truly human. Recent increased tourism and hiking in the area had attracted their attention, resulting in several disappearances officially attributed to exposure or wildlife attacks. "They're drawn to fear," he said. "They feed on it before they feed on flesh. The more afraid you are, the stronger they become." He offered to guide me to the trailhead by a route they rarely watch. Having few alternatives, I cautiously accepted, though I kept my knife ready and maintained distance between us. As we hiked, he pointed out signs I'd missed, marks on trees indicating territorial boundaries, subtle arrangements of stones marking safe passages. He showed me caves in the hillsides where they sheltered during daylight. "They can't be killed with ordinary weapons," he told me when I asked about defense. "The most we can do is know their ways and avoid them. They've been here longer than us." We traveled quickly, taking routes that often seemed to double back or circle, but somehow made consistent progress. By late afternoon, we'd covered ground that would have taken me substantially longer alone. As we descended below 7,000 feet, cellular service suddenly returned to my phone, multiple missed calls and texts appearing at once. Among them was an alert about 3 hikers reported missing in the Chuska Mountains over the past month. The guide grew increasingly nervous as the sun lowered, urging faster pace. "They'll know you're leaving their territory. They don't like to lose what they consider theirs." With the trailhead visible in the distance, perhaps half a mile through thinning forest, he stopped abruptly. "I go no further. The parking area is just ahead. Don't stop. Don't look back." Before I could respond, he'd vanished into the underbrush with surprising speed for his age. I continued alone, the path now wide and well-maintained. Normal forest sounds had returned. Bird calls, wind in the branches, the distant rumble of vehicles on the access road. Then I heard it one final time. That distinctive call, rising and falling in pitch, coming from the ridge high above. Looking back, I saw a distant figure silhouetted against the evening sky, standing upright on a rocky outcropping. Even at this distance, I could see it wasn't human, its proportions all wrong, head elongated and crowned with what might have been antlers. It raised one impossibly long arm, as if in farewell. I ran the remaining distance to the trailhead, finding my rental car undisturbed where I'd left it 5 days earlier. As I fumbled with the keys, something caught my eye. A small bundle of twigs and hair, bound together with sinew, placed carefully on the driver's seat. I drove nonstop to the nearest town, filed a report with local authorities about the missing hikers, and showed them my photographs. They took my information with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism. The Forest Service promised to investigate both the destruction of my camp and the shrine in the clearing. 1 month later, I received an official report indicating they'd found no evidence of the structures I'd described, no unusual tracks, and no signs of other people or dangerous wildlife in the areas I'd specified. The damage to my equipment was attributed to bears. The 3 missing hikers were eventually found alive, though severely dehydrated and suffering exposure, with no memory of what had happened during their lost days. I've never returned to those mountains, but sometimes, on cold nights when the wind makes strange sounds against my windows, I dream of that figure on the ridge, watching, waiting, unbound by human understanding of time or death. And I know with absolute certainty that if I ever ventured back into those remote forests, something ancient and patient would be waiting for me. Something that now knows my scent, my fears, and perhaps even my name.